Welcome to Signal Ahead. I'm Alfred. Today's briefing, Neuroscience, Computational, Thursday, July 30. This is the synthesis above the noise, not the headlines, but the deep currents beneath them. Let's get into it. There is a moment, reading across the current literature in computational neuroscience, when a pattern surfaces that the casual observer of science headlines would almost certainly miss. It is not the arrival of some new brain-scanning gadget, nor another artificial network that mimics visual cortex. It is something quieter and, I think, far more consequential. The field has begun to converge, from many directions at once, on a single conviction, that the mind is a thing that does not merely represent the world, but places bets against it. That perception, attention, even the sense of which way is up, are best understood as active wagers made under uncertainty, constantly revised, constantly paid for. Let me draw the line that connects the scattered dots, because it runs through work that on the surface has nothing to do with one another. Consider first a rather elegant piece of theoretical housekeeping. Some years ago, it was shown that a certain popular framework for describing intelligent agents, active inference, the idea that a creature acts so as to minimize its surprise, collapsed into something disappointingly inert under the simplest assumptions. If you built the agent with linear dynamics and tidy Gaussian noise, its curiosity vanished. Its incentive to go and look, to gather information, evaporated entirely, and what remained was a mere filter. Its behavior fixed in advance, indifferent to what it might learn. A ghost of an agent. Now the interesting question became, what is the smallest change that brings the curiosity back? And the answer that has emerged is telling. You restore the drive to explore the moment the world's noise depends on where you stand in it. When your sensor's accuracy degrades with range, say, so that moving closer genuinely buys you a clearer look. The lesson is not technical trivia. It is that information seeking is not an add-on to cognition. It is what you get the instant the cost of ignorance varies with your position. Uncertainty must have a geography before the mind bothers to move through it. Hold that thought. And now look at the fly. A walking fly holds a single goal direction as a bump of activity across a population of neurons in a structure with the marvelous name of the fan-shaped body. The old story would have said, the fly picks its goal by a winner. Take all contest, competitors fight, one survives. But when you trace the actual wiring, neuron by neuron, in a reconstructed brain, that is not what you find. The inhibition is almost entirely global. A mere handful of cells damp every goal, neuron roughly equally. This is not selection. It is normalization. The fly does not stage a battle among rival intentions. It simply keeps whatever goal has been set as one clean, single bump. The commitment is maintained, not fought for. And that distinction between choosing and keeping is exactly the sort of thing that dissolves when you look only at behavior and only sharpens when you look at mechanism. Then there is the matter of which way is up. The visually perceived vertical, it turns out, can be bent by the orientation of lines in your peripheral vision, and three separate empirical regularities describe how. What is lovely is that all three fall out of a single principle borrowed from physics. The perceived vertical is the principal axis of the orientation structure in your visual field, an order parameter, the same mathematics one uses for liquid crystals and magnets aligning. The brain, in other words, is computing a population average over a doubled angle space, and the felt sense of vertical is simply where that average points. A subjective experience reduced to the argument of a complex sum. Do you see the shape forming? In each case, the field is moving away from the metaphor of the brain as a passive mirror and toward the brain as an inference engine that must decide where to point its resources, whether that is a fly holding a heading, an agent deciding whether closeness is worth the walk, or a visual system settling on an axis. And this same logic reaches all the way up to the strangest frontier, The effort to capture inner experience itself at scale, to interview thousands of people about the texture of a single moment of consciousness, using machines trained in a discipline built precisely to stop us from confabulating about our own minds. What I want to argue across our time together is that computational neuroscience is quietly abandoning its founding division of labor. For decades, it split into camps: those who modeled single neurons and their spikes, those who modeled populations and their densities, and those who modeled behavior and cognition from the top. Those camps are fusing, and the solvent is a shared language of prediction, uncertainty, and cost. The refractory neuron, the topology of an organoid's spontaneous chatter, the meditator recovering attention from a wandering mind, these are becoming dialects of one grammar. Whether that grammar is genuinely the brain's own, or merely the most seductive story we can currently tell about it, is the question I want to hold up to the light. So let us begin where the mathematics is hardest, and the stakes are quietly enormous, with what a single spiking neuron, and a population of them, is actually doing. There is a temptation, when you survey a week's worth of work in a field, to treat it as a heap of unrelated curiosities. Here, someone is watching the brain respond to a cut in a film. There, someone is counting the nostrils. An animal needs to follow a scent. Elsewhere, a fly holds a single direction in its head, and someone is asking what circuit keeps that direction from wobbling. It looks like a jumble, but if you stand back and let your eyes go soft, a current moves beneath all of it, and it flows in one direction. The field is quietly abandoning the tidy artificial trial in favor of the messy, continuous stream, and it is building the mathematics to survive that decision. Consider what the classical experiment demanded of us. To hear the brain's response over the roar of its own noise, we chopped experience into hundreds of identical little episodes, flashed the same stimulus again and again, and averaged. The average is honest, but it is bought at a price. We abandon the very thing we wanted to study. Nobody experiences life as a repeated independent trial, and so we see the effort to align brain signals, not to some laboratory flash, but to the natural seams of a narrative, the sharp transitions, the cinematic cuts, and to show that the brain throws up a recognizable, structured response to them. The transition becomes the event. The film runs on, unbroken, and the analysis meets it where it lives. That is the current, from the contrived repetition toward the continuous, toward the naturalistic, toward the moment as it actually occurs. You can feel the same pull in how inner experience is being approached. The old bargain there was between depth and scale. You could interview a handful of people carefully about a single sampled moment, or you could hand thousands a fixed questionnaire that told them, in advance, what shape their experience was allowed to take. Both are compromises against the continuous texture of a mind in time. The move to have a machine conduct the delicate expositional interview is, whatever one thinks of it, an attempt to keep the depth while opening the door to scale. It is the same instinct as aligning to cinematic cuts, stop imposing the format, and follow the stream. Now, following the stream is a noble aspiration, and it is also mathematically terrifying. The reason we clung to the artificial trial for so long is that it made the noise tractable. Abandon it, and you inherit the full, seething complexity of a system that never sits still. And this is where the deeper structural trend reveals itself, because the same week that gives us naturalistic recording also gives us the tools to tame naturalistic dynamics. There is work building a rigorous spectral account of how populations of spiking neurons behave once you honor the fact that a neuron, having fired, must fall silent for a moment before it can fire again. That refractory pause sounds like a footnote. It is not. Incorporating it turns the problem into something subtle and non-symmetric, and out of the mathematics fall exceptional points, places where steady, settling behavior suddenly coalesces and gives birth to oscillation. The theory does not merely describe the stream, it predicts where the stream will start to ripple. And elsewhere, the reach for topological structure in the spontaneous activity of brain organoids, little cultured knots of human and mouse cortex, firing away with no stimulus at all, no task, no trial. What could you possibly average there? It's nothing. There is no repetition to lean on. So instead you read the shape of the correlations directly, and you ask whether loops and holes appear in that shape at the modest number of neurons a real recording actually delivers. That is the continuous stream in its purest form, activity with no external event to anchor it, and the response is not to flee back to the flashcard, but to find geometry inside the flux. So the deep current is a double movement, and the two halves are inseparable. On one side, an experimental turn toward film rather than flashes, toward interviews rather than checkboxes, toward spontaneous activity rather than evoked responses, toward the animal tracking a real odor trail along a real surface. On the other side, a theoretical turn of exactly matched ambition, operator theory, spectral decomposition, persistent homology, order parameters that summarize a whole field of orientations in a single complex number. The naturalism would collapse into anecdote without the mathematics. The mathematics would be an empty exercise without the naturalistic data crying out for it. What unites them is a refusal of the false economy that the field made for decades, the belief that we had to trade realism for rigor, that the price of a clean signal was an artificial world. The current beneath the noise is the slow, hard-won discovery that we may not have to pay it after all, that we can let the film run, let the mind wander, let the culture fire in the dark, and still say something precise about what is happening. Keep that in mind, because it changes what the next generation of results is even allowed to mean. There's a temptation, when you survey a week's worth of computational neuroscience, to sort it into tidy piles. This pile studies the brain, that pile builds tools, this one philosophizes. But what strikes me, standing back from the whole spread, is that the piles keep collapsing into one another. And the reason they collapse tells us something about where the field is heading and what we ought to keep an eye on. Consider the recurring move I'd call letting the naturalistic in. For decades, the discipline bought its precision at the price of artifice. If you wanted a clean brain signal, you showed a subject the same flash of light 300 times and averaged away the noise. Rigorous, yes, but a brain watching the same dot 300 times is not a brain doing anything a brain evolved to do. So it's telling to see the effort to pull evoked potentials not from repeated dots, but from the sharp cuts in a film someone is actually watching, using the structure of the stimulus itself as the clock. The cut becomes the trial, and crucially, when you scramble the scenes so the story no longer coheres, the signal changes, which means you're not just measuring the eye's startle at a visual discontinuity, you're measuring comprehension. That's the second-order implication worth marking. The boundary between controlled experiment and lived experience is becoming porous, and the field is learning to extract rigor from richness rather than by stripping it away. The same instinct animates the work on capturing inner experience. Here, the old trade-off was between depth and scale. You could interview a handful of people meticulously about a single sampled moment, or you could survey thousands with a tick-box form that dictates in advance what an experience is allowed to be. The proposal to use a language model as an interviewer, grounded in a genuine phenomenological method, is an attempt to have both. Now, I'd urge caution here, and this is precisely the sort of thing to watch. A method for apprehending inner experience is, in the wrong hands, a method for imposing a template of inner experience. The value of the classical approach was its refusal to presuppose, automate the interviewer. And you risk automating the presupposition, the machine gently steering every subject toward the kinds of answers it was trained to find interesting. The prize is real. So is the failure mode. And this brings me to what I think is the quiet center of the whole collection, the paper on competitive and complementary tools. It models the user, the tool, and the task as a single system in which competence and reliance co-evolve, and finds the outcome is bistable. Above a certain threshold of tool availability, the competent state is simply destroyed. The user outsources completely, and competence collapses to a dependent flaw. What's chilling is the hysteresis. Lowering the tool's availability does not restore competence until a far lower threshold. History decides the state, not present circumstance. Two people with identical access today can sit in opposite and lasting conditions. One skilled, one dependent, decided only by which they built first. I raise it here at the end because it reframes everything else. Every tool in this survey, the AI interviewer, the cortical models that predict neural firing, the frameworks that forecast conscious choice from embeddings, is a candidate for that bistable dynamic. We build instruments to externalize thought, from the tally stick to the map to the model, and the model quietly asks whether we've noticed that the tool changes the toolmaker. The field is producing systems that stand in for perception, for interviewing, for judgment. The thing to watch is not whether they work, it's what they do to the competence of the humans who lean on them, and whether that lean, once taken, can ever be untaken. So what should you watch for? 3 things. First, whether naturalistic methods keep their teeth, whether the scrambled scene control, the comparison that proves you're measuring meaning and not mere flinching, survives the migration into the wild. Second, whether tools built to scale human insight preserve the humility of the methods they scale or quietly overwrite them. And third, the reliance dynamic itself, because it applies to us, the practitioners, as surely as to any subject. The most sophisticated denoising model, the most fluent interviewer, the most seductive unifying principle of conscious value, each is a tool availability raised. And the question the whole field must eventually face is whether it is building instruments it can put down. I don't think the answer is refusal. The tally and the map made us more, not less. But hysteresis is unforgiving, and the state you occupy is fixed by what you built first. Build carefully. That's the signal for today. The noise will keep coming, we'll keep finding what's underneath it. This has been Signal Ahead with Alfred. Until next time.